"You're not on the guest list." The woman at the ballroom entrance said it quietly, but not quietly enough. I stood there holding a cream-colored gift box while 20 or 30 people in black tie turned to stare at me like I'd walked into the wrong wedding. Then my mother stepped forward in her navy silk gown, smiled at the guests around her, and said, "There must be some confusion. We didn't invite her. Her. Not Madeline. Not my daughter. Just her." My father didn't say a word. He adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo and looked past me toward the valet stand like the weather suddenly mattered more than I did. "Mom," I said softly, "it's your 40th anniversary." "Exactly," she replied, "a private family celebration." Behind her, my younger sister Sophie covered her mouth to hide a smile. "Maybe she misunderstood the date," she said. A few people laughed. Small laughs. The kind polite people use when they don't want to look uncomfortable. I felt my fingers tighten around the ribbon on the box, so hard the paper bent inward. And the worst part? Nobody looked shocked. Like this wasn't even unusual anymore. Before I continue, if this story truly resonates with you, only if it speaks to your heart, I'd really appreciate you taking a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Sometimes knowing someone else out there is listening makes these stories feel a little less lonely. My name is Madeline Carter. I'm 34 years old, and the night my own parents told me I wasn't invited to their anniversary was the night everything inside my family finally cracked open. But to understand why I showed up anyway carrying that gift box, you need to understand what my family had spent years pretending not to see. The Whitmore estate sat just outside Newport, Rhode Island, on 22 acres of oceanfront property with white columns, slate pathways, and gardens so perfectly maintained they looked fake from a distance. My grandfather built the house in 1961 after returning from the Navy with a construction contract and exactly $312 in his checking account. He used to tell me every inch of that estate mattered because every inch cost him something. Saturdays when I was little, he'd walk me through the greenhouse with dirt under his fingernails and say, "Pay attention to the things people overlook, Maddie. Those are usually the things holding everything together." My mother preferred Sophie. Everyone knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. Sophie photographed better. Sophie knew how to charm donors at charity events. Sophie married a hedge fund attorney by 28, and somehow always looked perfect in pictures. Meanwhile, I spent most days wearing work boots and carrying blueprints through aging estates that smelled like old wood and leaking pipes. I specialized in historic property preservation, which sounds impressive until you explain it at a dinner party and watch people's eyes glaze over halfway through the sentence. My mother once introduced me to her friends by saying, "Madeline does something with old buildings." That was 2 months after my firm saved a $6 million property from foreclosure. But in my family, quiet success didn't count. Only visible success mattered. Expensive cars, country club memberships, magazine-worthy marriages. Appearances were everything. 3 years ago, my father's real estate company started bleeding money after a series of bad investments in luxury condos outside Boston. Nobody in the family talked about it directly, but I noticed things. Deferred landscaping, staff quietly disappearing, repairs delayed. My father canceling his annual golf retreat for the first time in 20 years. Then one afternoon, I walked into his office and saw him staring at a foreclosure notice with both hands pressed flat against his desk like he might collapse if he let go. "Dad," I said carefully, "how bad is it?" He folded the paper too quickly. "It's handled." "Is the estate in trouble?" "You don't understand these things, Madeline." I remember that sentence because it settled into my chest like a stone. You don't understand these things. Meanwhile, I'd spent the last decade restructuring distressed estates across New England. But to him, I was still the disappointing daughter with practical shoes and a failed engagement from 6 years ago. That engagement had become another family embarrassment. Daniel left me 3 months before the wedding after deciding he needed someone more ambitious. My mother actually said, "Well, at least it happened before invitations went out," like that was the tragedy worth mentioning. After that, I stopped coming around as often. Not because I stopped loving my family, because loving them started to feel humiliating. Still, every Christmas I mailed gifts. Every birthday I called. Every crisis I showed up, even when nobody asked me to, especially then. And standing outside that ballroom with my mother blocking the entrance, I realized something that made my stomach twist harder than the humiliation itself. She wasn't surprised to see me. She looked nervous. Not angry, nervous. Then my eyes drifted past her shoulder toward the ballroom, and I noticed something sitting beside the stage near the anniversary slideshow projector. A dark green metal lockbox I recognized instantly. My grandfather's lockbox, the one that disappeared the week before he died. The one my father swore had been empty. And in that moment I understood they weren't afraid of me ruining the party. They were afraid of what I might already know. The strange thing about growing up in the Whitmore family was that nobody ever openly said Sophie mattered more. They just built the entire world around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. When I was 8, my mother hired a photographer to take Christmas portraits in front of the grand staircase at the estate. Sophie wore a white velvet dress with pearl buttons and curled blonde hair that took 2 hours to style. I wore a sweater my grandmother knitted 2 winters earlier because my mother said there was no point buying another dress for someone who would probably stain it anyway. Halfway through the photos, Sophie started crying because she wanted the puppy in her lap instead of mine. My mother immediately lifted the dog out of my arms and handed it to her. "Smile, sweetheart," she whispered to Sophie while fixing her ribbon. Then she looked at me and said, "Madeline, stand a little farther back. You are blocking the light." I remember staring at the polished floor beneath my shoes, trying to figure out how a person could block light just by existing. Those little moments became the architecture of our family. Sophie got piano lessons. I got told not to slam doors because repairs were expensive. Sophie got a silver Lexus for her 16th birthday with a giant red bow across the hood. My father handed me a check for $800 when I turned 16 and said, "A practical girl like you probably prefers something used." He said it kindly too, which somehow made it worse. The summer before sophomore year of high school, I spent 3 months repainting guest cottages on the estate because my father said hiring contractors cost too much. Every afternoon, I climbed aluminum ladders in 90-degree heat with paint on my hands while Sophie practiced tennis at the Newport Country Club. One afternoon, she walked past me holding an iced coffee and laughed. "You seriously look like maintenance staff." My father overheard her. He laughed too. Well, Maddie always did like working with her hands. That night at dinner, Sophie talked for 40 straight minutes about a boy named Trevor, who invited her onto his father's yacht. My mother listened like Sophie was announcing a cure for cancer. Meanwhile, I had spent the day restoring original cedar shutters built in the 1960s. Not one person asked about them. My grandfather noticed, though. He always noticed. Around midnight, I heard soft tapping outside my bedroom window and found him standing on the patio, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Walk with me," he said. We crossed the dark lawn toward the greenhouse, while ocean wind rattled through the hedges. He moved slower back then because of his knee, but he still carried himself like a man who had built something with his bare hands. Inside the greenhouse, the air smelled like soil and salt water. He handed me one of the mugs and looked at my paint-covered fingers. "You know why your father struggles with you?" he asked quietly. I frowned. "Because I am not Sophie?" He smiled sadly at that. "Because you remind him too much of me." I did not understand what he meant at 16. I think part of me understands now. My grandfather hated waste, hated performative wealth. He once drove a 12-year-old Ford pickup to a charity gala just to irritate my mother. He cared about foundations, structure, quiet things that lasted. Sophie inherited my mother's love of appearances. I inherited his instinct to repair what everyone else ignored. By the time I graduated college with a degree in architectural preservation, my family had already decided my career was a phase. At Thanksgiving, my Uncle Warren asked Sophie about investment portfolios for 20 minutes straight before finally turning to me and saying, "So are you still doing that house decorating thing?" "Historic preservation," I corrected gently. "I restore aging estates and landmark properties." "That sounds expensive," my mother interrupted before taking a sip of wine. "I cannot imagine people actually paying for that." 2 years later, I bought my first property, a collapsing Victorian outside Providence with water damage so severe half the ceiling had caved in. I lived there while restoring it room by room, because I could not afford both rent and renovation costs. My mother visited exactly once. She stood in the kitchen wearing cream-colored heels completely unsuited for construction dust and said, "You know, Sophie says there is still time for you to pivot into something more stable." More stable. The house sold 14 months later for triple what I paid. That was the first major success of my career. My father sent a text that said congratulations with no punctuation. Sophie posted 6 photos from a ski trip in Aspen the same day, and my mother framed one in the hallway. Still, I kept showing up for family dinners. I kept bringing birthday gifts. I kept helping whenever something broke at the estate, because some part of me still believed if I loved them correctly enough, eventually they would love me back in the same language. But standing outside that ballroom years later, staring at my grandfather's missing lockbox near the stage, I suddenly remembered something else from childhood. The last conversation I ever had with him before he died. He had pressed a brass key into my hand and said, "One day this family is going to tell a story about you that is not true. When that happens, do not let them bury the real one with me." At the time, I thought he was talking about inheritance. I realize now he meant something much bigger. The first time people in my family realized I might actually be successful was completely by accident. 3 years before the anniversary party, I was standing inside the ballroom of the Ashcroft estate in Connecticut, wearing steel-toe boots and holding a flashlight while rain hammered the windows hard enough to shake the glass. The estate had been 1 week away from foreclosure when the owners hired my firm. Water damage had spread through the east wing. Half the electrical system needed replacing. The roof leaked into rooms lined with 200-year-old wallpaper worth more than most luxury cars. Every contractor before me told them restoration was impossible. I told them it would take 14 months and a lot of patience. That night I was balancing on scaffolding, checking a cracked ceiling beam, when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Sophie. I almost ignored it. We barely spoke outside obligatory holidays. But something made me answer. "Madeline," she said immediately, her voice tight and rushed. "Mom is freaking out." I climbed down carefully. "About what?" "Dad's company. Something happened with the Boston properties." My stomach dropped. "How bad?" There was silence for a second. Then she lowered her voice. "I heard him tell Mom the bank might call in the loans." I leaned against the cold plaster wall while workers rolled equipment across the marble floor behind me. "How much debt?" "I do not know exactly. A lot." Sophie sounded irritated more than worried, like the situation was personally inconveniencing her. "Mom says if the estate gets tied up in this, it will destroy everything." Everything. In my family, everything always meant appearances first. I drove to Newport the next morning, after 4 hours of sleep, and found my father sitting alone in his office, with untouched coffee growing cold beside him. Financial statements covered the desk in uneven stacks. For the first time in my life, he looked old, really old. "You should have called me," I said quietly. He rubbed both hands over his face. "There is nothing you can do. You do not know that, Madeline." His voice carried that same tired dismissal I had heard since childhood. "This is corporate restructuring, not repainting old windows." I remember staring at him for a moment because part of me honestly wondered if he truly had no idea what I did for a living. "Dad," I said carefully, "I negotiate distressed property recoveries worth millions of dollars. Historic preservation is not finance." "No," I replied softly, "but foreclosure is." He looked at me differently then. Not respectfully exactly, more like someone hearing an unfamiliar sound in a familiar room. I spent the next 3 weeks quietly reviewing his documents after work. I discovered the Boston developments were over-leveraged. Construction costs had exploded during delays, and one investor had already started preparing legal action. Worst of all, the estate itself had been used as collateral against several emergency loans. If the lenders moved aggressively, my family could lose everything my grandfather built. One night, around 11:30, I sat across from my father at the long mahogany dining table, while rain slid down the windows. Yellow legal pads covered the table between us. "You need liquidity fast," I said, "and you need to separate the estate from the development portfolio immediately." My father loosened his tie. "I already tried." "No. You tried protecting your reputation. That is different." He stared at me after that, long enough that I thought he might finally get angry. Instead, he quietly asked, "What would you do?" It was the first time in my entire life my father had ever asked for my opinion like it mattered. I worked 80-hour weeks for nearly 4 months after that. I negotiated with lenders, structured a temporary preservation trust, connected my father with 2 investors from New York who specialized in distressed luxury assets. I even leveraged my own company line of credit at one point to prevent a deadline from collapsing the entire deal. Nobody in the family knew except my father. Not my mother, not Sophie, not even the attorneys handling the public side of the restructuring. The deal finally closed on a freezing January morning, while I sat inside a coffee shop near Providence, reviewing revised documents with my laptop balanced beside a half-eaten blueberry muffin. My father called exactly 6 minutes after the wire transfer cleared. "It is done," he said. His voice sounded strange, smaller somehow. "The estate is protected." I closed my eyes for a second and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for months. "Good." Silence stretched between us. Then he said quietly, "Thank you, Maddie." I think that moment mattered more to me than it should have, because for one brief second, I thought things might finally change between us. I thought maybe my father saw me now. But families like mine do not transform overnight. They adjust just enough to survive, then slip back into old patterns the second the crisis passes. 2 weeks later, my mother hosted a charity dinner at the estate like nothing had ever happened. Crystal glasses, imported flowers, string quartet near the staircase, guests praising the beauty of the property they almost lost without knowing it. I arrived late after meeting contractors in Vermont all day. My coat still smelled faintly like sawdust and winter air. As I stepped into the ballroom, I overheard my mother talking to one of her friends near the champagne tower. "Sophie has such incredible instincts for business," she said proudly. "She really helped steady Richard during all the financial stress." I stopped walking. Her friend smiled. "That must have been hard on the family." "Thankfully, Sophie knows how to handle pressure." My mother took a sip of wine. "Madeline means well, of course, but she has always preferred her little renovation projects." Little renovation projects. I stood there listening while servers passed trays of crab cakes around the room built on the lie that my sister had saved the family. My father saw me standing there from across the ballroom. For 1 second our eyes met, and then he looked away. After that dinner, something shifted in the family, but not in the way I hoped. My father started calling Sophie into meetings she had no experience handling. My mother began introducing her as the future of Whitmore Holdings at charity events and yacht club dinners. And slowly, almost carefully, a new version of history started spreading through our family like perfume through a room. In their version, Sophie had stepped up during the financial crisis. Sophie had stabilized my father emotionally. Sophie had helped guide important decisions. The truth became smaller every time they retold it. Mine disappeared entirely. At first I told myself it did not matter. I had my own business, my own life, my own projects. Recognition was not the point. But there is something uniquely painful about watching people erase your fingerprints from work that nearly destroyed you to complete, especially when they smile while doing it. About 6 months after the refinancing closed, my mother hosted another dinner at the estate. 24 guests. Long candlelit tables in the garden overlooking the water. Everything smelled like sea salt, roses, and expensive wine. I arrived late from a restoration site in Vermont with dirt still caught beneath one thumbnail despite scrubbing my hands twice in a gas station restroom. Sophie spotted me first. "There she is," she announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Our mysterious disappearing sister." Several people laughed softly. I kissed my mother on the cheek. She barely turned her head. "You could have changed before coming," she murmured while adjusting her napkin. "You look exhausted." I drove 3 hours straight from a site inspection. "Well," she glanced at Sophie's silk dress. "Presentation matters." During dinner, one of my father's investors asked Sophie how she managed to navigate the family through such a difficult year. I actually stopped chewing for a second because I thought surely someone would correct him. Maybe my father, maybe my mother, maybe Sophie herself. Instead, Sophie smiled modestly and lowered her wine glass. "Honestly, I just tried to keep everyone calm and focused." My chest tightened so suddenly it almost hurt. "You must have learned a lot from your father," the investor said. "Actually," Sophie replied, "Dad and I worked closely on the restructuring strategy." Worked closely on the restructuring strategy. I stared at her across the candlelight while the words settled into the tablecloth between us like ash. Sophie had never attended a single lender meeting. She could not have explained half the legal terms involved if someone handed her a dictionary. But nobody questioned her. Why would they? She fit the role better than I did. Polished, elegant, socially effortless, the kind of daughter people expected to inherit things. I looked toward my father. He kept cutting his steak in slow, even motions. My mother nodded proudly beside him. Neither of them corrected the lie. That was the moment I realized silence could become betrayal too. Not loud betrayal. Not dramatic betrayal. Just quiet permission for the wrong story to survive. After dinner, I found Sophie alone near the back terrace, scrolling through her phone beneath string lights swaying in the ocean wind. "Why did you say that?" I asked quietly. She looked up without guilt. "Say what?" "That you handled the restructuring. I helped emotionally." "Sophie." My voice cracked slightly despite trying to control it. "You know that is not what happened." She slipped her phone into her purse. "Madeline, nobody wants the complicated version. The complicated version is the truth. Truth is not always what people remember." She said it so casually, like she was discussing weather patterns instead of my life. I stared at her. "You are letting them believe you saved the estate. And you are letting them believe you did not." That sentence stayed with me for months. Because she was right, I was letting it happen. Every time I stayed quiet to avoid conflict. Every time I smiled through another dinner. Every time I chose peace over correction. I was helping bury myself. Things became worse after my grandfather's former attorney retired. A man named Charles Bennett. He had worked with my grandfather for nearly 40 years and knew every inch of the estate's legal history. 2 weeks before his retirement party, he called me unexpectedly. "Madeline," he said carefully, "have you spoken to your father recently about the estate documents?" I frowned. "What documents?" Silence. Papers shifting. Then a quieter voice. "There are some things happening that do not sit right with me." I drove to his office the next morning through freezing rain. Charles looked tired. Older than I remembered. He closed the door before speaking. "Your father has been restructuring ownership pathways tied to the estate." "What does that mean?" He hesitated. "It means Sophie's name has started appearing where yours once did." I felt cold all over. "Mine?" Charles removed his glasses slowly. "Your grandfather intended certain protections to remain connected to you specifically." "What protections?" But before he could answer, his assistant knocked sharply on the office door. "Richard Whitmore is here," she announced nervously. Charles's entire expression changed. He stood too quickly. "You need to leave through the back hallway." "Charles." "Now, Madeline." I had never heard fear in his voice before. As I stepped into the narrow service corridor behind his office, I heard the front door open and my father's voice carry through reception. Calm, controlled, dangerous in a way I had never noticed as a child. "Charles," he said evenly, "we need to discuss exactly what you have been telling my daughter." I barely slept after leaving Charles Bennett's office. The image of my father standing in that reception area kept replaying in my head all night long. Not angry, not emotional, calm. That was the unsettling part. My father only became that controlled when he had already decided how a situation would end. Around 2:30 in the morning, I sat at my kitchen counter in Providence wearing an old gray sweatshirt while cold coffee sat untouched beside my laptop. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. I opened my email and stared at a draft addressed to my father for nearly 20 minutes before typing a single sentence. "Dad, I think we need to have an honest conversation about what is happening with the estate." I deleted it immediately. Honest conversation. The phrase sounded ridiculous even in my own head. Families like mine did not have honest conversations. We had polished dinners and carefully edited stories. By morning, I convinced myself Charles might have misunderstood something. Maybe there was a legal explanation. Maybe my father planned to tell me eventually. I called him twice that afternoon. Straight to voicemail both times. At 6:15 that evening, I finally received a text. "In meetings all day. We will talk soon. Love you, love you." My father only wrote those words when he wanted something to feel resolved without actually resolving it. 3 days passed. Then 6. Then 12. Every call went unanswered. Every text received polite silence. Meanwhile, small strange things started happening around the estate. My security credentials for the property gates stopped working. The house manager I had known since childhood suddenly became formal with me over email. "Mrs. Whitmore has requested all restoration approvals go through Sophie moving forward." Sophie, who once asked me if limestone and marble were basically the same thing. I drove to Newport unannounced one Sunday afternoon, hoping face-to-face conversation might break whatever invisible wall had formed around my family. The estate looked beautiful in late October light. Orange leaves scattered across the long gravel driveway. Ocean wind moving through the hedges, home, or at least the closest thing I ever had to one. I found my mother arranging flowers in the breakfast room, wearing cream cashmere and gold bracelets that clicked softly against the vase. "You should have called first," she said without looking up. I did call. "We have been very busy." I stood there holding my car keys too tightly. "Mom, what is happening?" She adjusted a hydrangea stem. "What do you mean?" "Charles Bennett said there were changes being made involving the estate." Finally, she looked at me. "Charles is retired now. He gets confused. Did Dad move Sophie into ownership positions?" A pause, tiny, barely visible. "Sophie has been much more involved with the family recently." "That is not what I asked." My mother sighed softly like I was exhausting her. "Madeline, your sister is stable." "Stable." "And I am not. You disappear for months renovating old properties in different states. You live alone. You do not attend functions unless pressured. Your priorities are difficult for people to understand." I stared at her because suddenly I realized this was not about business at all. It was about presentation. Sophie looked like continuity. I looked like unpredictability. "I saved this estate," I said quietly before I could stop myself. The room went still. My mother's face changed instantly. Not gratitude, not guilt, irritation. "You need to stop saying that." The sentence hit harder than yelling would have. "It happened," I whispered. "Dad knows it happened. Families survive because people choose peace over ego." "Peace?" My voice cracked slightly. "Mom, they were preparing foreclosure notices." "Lower your voice. You told everyone Sophie handled it." "Because Sophie stayed." I blinked. "Stayed? You always leave, Madeline." That sentence followed me all the way back to Providence. "You always leave." As if every distance between us had been created by me alone. As if years of dismissal and quiet humiliation had not pushed me out inch by inch. I tried again anyway. That was the pathetic part. I kept trying. I mailed my father copies of restructuring records with handwritten notes attached. No response. I emailed requesting a meeting. Silence. I even wrote my mother a 6-page letter one night after drinking half a glass of wine I never finished. I told her I did not care about money or ownership. I told her I just wanted the truth acknowledged. I told her I missed my family. 2 weeks later, the envelope came back unopened with return to sender stamped across the front in red ink. I sat on my apartment floor staring at it for a long time. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from realizing people can rewrite your role in their lives while you are still standing there loving them. Thanksgiving came and went without an invitation. Then, Christmas. Sophie posted photos online beside the estate fireplace, wearing matching pajamas with my parents, while comments filled with things like beautiful family and holiday perfection. My name never appeared once. Around New Year's, I received a voicemail from my father at 1:17 in the morning. His voice sounded tired, older somehow. "Madeline," he said quietly, "sometimes protecting a family means making difficult decisions people will not understand." That was all he said. No explanation, no apology, just another carefully shaped sentence floating where accountability should have been. I listened to it 3 times, sitting alone beside my kitchen window, while snow fell outside in complete silence. Then I deleted it. Not because it stopped hurting, because I finally understood no message was coming that would fix this. No confession. No sudden recognition. Just distance. Carefully maintained distance. And somewhere inside all that silence, I started feeling something unfamiliar growing beneath the grief. Not anger exactly, something colder. The beginning of detachment. The winter after my family stopped speaking to me felt endless. Rhode Island winters always carry a certain heaviness anyway. Gray skies, salt-stained roads, ocean winds sharp enough to cut through wool coats. But that year, everything felt quieter than usual, like the entire world had stepped back a few feet and left me standing alone in the middle of it. I buried myself in work because work was measurable. Work made sense. Old buildings told the truth if you listened carefully enough. Cracks meant pressure. Water stains meant leaks. Foundations shifted for reasons you could actually trace. People were harder. I spent most days restoring a 19th century inn outside Portsmouth, where half the original beams had rotted beneath layers of cosmetic renovation. Every morning I climbed narrow staircases carrying blueprints and coffee, while contractors shouted measurements through dust-filled hallways. At night, I drove back to my apartment with aching shoulders and radio static filling the silence. Sometimes I would unlock my door and realize nobody had spoken my name all day. One Tuesday in February, I came home after a 14-hour workday and found a package sitting outside my apartment door. No return address. My stomach tightened immediately because for one ridiculous second, I thought maybe my father had finally reached out properly. Inside was a silver picture frame wrapped in tissue paper, a family photograph from Christmas 8 years earlier. My parents, Sophie, me standing slightly off to the side in a dark green sweater. But my face had been cut out carefully with scissors. I sat down slowly on the kitchen floor, holding the frame in both hands. There was no note, no explanation, just the missing space where I used to be. I stared at it for a very long time before finally calling Sophie. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. What? No hello, no warmth. Just what? Did you send me something? Silence, then a sigh. Madeline, I am in the middle of dinner. Did you? Another pause. Mom thought it would help you move on. I actually laughed once because my brain could not process the sentence properly. Move on? You have been making everything difficult for months. Somebody mailed me a photograph with my face cut out of it. You are being dramatic. Dramatic, that word again. Every feeling too inconvenient for my family eventually became drama. Why are you doing this? I whispered. Sophie lowered her voice slightly. Because you keep trying to force your way back into something that already changed. Then she hung up. I slept maybe 2 hours that night. The next morning I dropped the frame into a kitchen drawer and went back to work because what else was there to do? 2 weeks later, my grandfather's old groundskeeper, Walter, died from a stroke. He had worked at the estate for almost 30 years. He used to sneak me peppermint candies when I was little and taught me how to repair cracked stone pathways without replacing the original slate. I found out about his funeral from an online obituary posted by the local church. No one in my family called me. I almost did not go. Standing in the back of that small white chapel while snow fell outside felt unbearable somehow. But Walter mattered to me, so I went. My mother wore black cashmere and sat in the front pew beside Sophie. My father stared straight ahead the entire service. None of them acknowledged me, not once. Afterward, people gathered in the church hall drinking weak coffee from paper cups, while old photographs of Walter rotated across a projector screen. I stood near the back alone until Walter's widow approached me quietly. He kept talking about you before he passed, she said softly. I swallowed hard. Really? She nodded. He said you were the only Whitmore who noticed when workers got tired. I looked down at my coffee cup because suddenly I could not trust my face. Then she added gently, he also said your grandfather worried they would break your heart one day. That sentence stayed with me all through March. Maybe because by then something inside me already felt broken. Not shattered dramatically, just worn thin from disappointment. I stopped checking my phone hoping for messages from my parents. Stopped driving near the estate. Stopped telling people I was from Newport because explaining my family exhausted me. One night, my friend Elena came by my apartment carrying takeout containers and immediately frowned at the state of my kitchen. Architectural sketches covered the counters. Empty coffee mugs lined the sink. I had forgotten laundry in the washer for 3 days. You cannot keep living like this, she said quietly while unpacking food. I am fine. Madeline, she sat across from me at the table. You look tired all the way through. I stared at the steam rising from the soup container. I do not know how to stop missing people who clearly do not miss me back. Elena reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. Outside, freezing rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, she asked, what if this is not about getting them back anymore? I frowned slightly. Then what is it about? She looked at me carefully before answering. Maybe it is about figuring out why they worked so hard to erase you in the first place. That question followed me for weeks afterward, and slowly, beneath all the grief and exhaustion and silence, something began shifting inside me. Because for the first time since all this started, I stopped asking whether my family loved me enough, and started wondering what exactly they were so afraid I might discover. The first thing I did after I stopped waiting for my family to call was repaint my apartment. It sounds small, but after months of feeling emotionally suspended between grief and anger, buying 2 gallons of warm white paint at a hardware store on a rainy Saturday felt strangely important. I spent the entire weekend covering the dark gray walls I had chosen after Daniel left me years earlier. By Sunday night, the apartment looked brighter, cleaner, less like a place someone stayed while waiting for another life to begin. Monday morning, I woke up at 5:30, made coffee, tied my hair back, and drove to a restoration site in Hartford before sunrise. No dramatic breakthrough, no sudden healing, just movement. I started taking projects farther outside New England after that. Old theaters in Pennsylvania, historic inns in Vermont, a deteriorating waterfront hotel in Savannah with cracked marble floors and water stains spreading across ballroom ceilings like ink. I worked constantly, not to avoid pain anymore, to build something that belonged entirely to me. By spring, my firm had grown enough that I needed actual employees instead of rotating contractors. Elena became my operations director after quitting a corporate architecture firm she hated. One afternoon, she walked into my office carrying a stack of invoices and said, "You know you are accidentally building a serious company, right?" I laughed softly without looking up from my laptop. "Nothing about this feels accidental." She dropped the papers onto my desk. "Madeline, we have more clients than we can currently handle. You turned down 3 projects this week." I finally looked up. Sunlight from the warehouse windows behind her caught dust particles floating through the room. "I just do not want to become one of those firms that forgets the buildings actually matter." Elena smirked. "You mean like firms that charge $400 an hour to recommend replacing original hardwood with laminate flooring?" Exactly those firms. We signed a lease on a converted brick warehouse in Providence that summer. Exposed beams, concrete floors, huge industrial windows overlooking the river. The first night after moving in, I stayed late organizing blueprints while rain tapped against the glass. Around 9:30, Elena rolled her chair backward and looked at me carefully. "You know something?" "What?" "You smile more now." The strange thing was, she was right. Not constantly, not dramatically. But small moments started returning. Morning coffee before job site inspections, music playing quietly while reviewing restoration plans, the satisfaction of walking through buildings everyone else had abandoned and seeing possibility instead of decay. My family still did not contact me. But gradually their silence stopped defining my days. Then, one Thursday afternoon in late August, everything shifted again. I was standing inside the lobby of the Blackthorn Hotel in Boston, reviewing stone restoration samples with a contractor when my phone rang from an unknown number. Madeline Carter speaking. "Miss Carter, this is Vivian Mercer from the New England Architectural Preservation Society." I stepped away from the workers instinctively. "Okay. I am calling because your restoration work at the Ashcroft Estate has been nominated for the Regional Preservation Excellence Award." For a second, I honestly thought she had the wrong person. "I am sorry, what?" She laughed softly. "Your project has received significant attention in the preservation community." I looked through the hotel's tall front windows at traffic moving down Tremont Street, while her words settled slowly into place. Significant attention. "The selection committee was especially impressed with your structural stabilization approach while preserving original 19th century detailing. Nobody in my family had ever spoken about my work like that. Not once." "There will be a formal ceremony in Newport this November," Vivian continued. "We would love for you to attend." Newport. Of course it was Newport. I almost declined immediately, but something inside me hesitated. "I will think about it," I said carefully. That evening, Elena bought champagne and plastic cups from a corner store and made everyone in the office stop working for 10 minutes. "To the most stubborn preservation specialist in America," she announced while raising her cup. "May she someday learn how to leave work before midnight." The team laughed. I laughed too, real laughter this time. The kind that catches you by surprise because your body briefly forgets how heavy things have been. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone at my desk scrolling through emails when a new message appeared from an address I recognized instantly. Sophie. My chest tightened before I even opened it. The subject line simply read, "Congratulations." That alone felt strange enough to unsettle me. Inside was one sentence. Mom saw the announcement online. Dad wants to meet. No apology. No explanation. Just Dad wants to meet. I stared at the screen for a long time, while city lights reflected softly against the office windows around me. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophie. "There are things you do not know about Grandpa's estate." I read that sentence 3 times. Beneath the office air conditioning, I suddenly felt cold all over again. Because deep down, I realized something important. My family had not reached out because they missed me. They reached out because something had changed, and whatever it was, they were running out of time to hide it. By October, my company no longer felt like something temporary. I was trying to prove to people who would never understand it. It felt real. The kind of real you could see in exhausted employees eating takeout around conference tables at 9 o'clock at night while blueprints covered every surface. The kind of real measured in contracts, payroll, and clients willing to trust you with buildings older than the country itself. Our office in Providence had grown from 4 employees to 14 in less than a year. We restored theaters, hotels, private estates, libraries, even an abandoned train station outside Philadelphia with stained glass windows boarded shut since the 1980s. Every morning I unlocked the office around 6:30 before anyone else arrived. I liked the quiet, the smell of coffee and drafting paper, the river outside still dark before sunrise. One Thursday I walked into the conference room carrying structural reports when I overheard 2 new employees talking near the printer. "Wait," one whispered. "That is Madeline Carter?" "Yeah," the other replied. "She is the founder." Founder! The word still startled me sometimes. Not because I did not earn it, because nobody in my family had ever spoken about me like I built anything worth naming. Around the same time, industry magazines started noticing our work. Small articles at first, then interviews, then invitations to speak at preservation conferences in Boston and Chicago. Elena printed one of the articles and taped it beside the office coffee machine after I refused to frame it. The headline read, "Restoring History with Madeline Carter." I tried taking it down twice. Both times someone taped it back up. "You know normal people celebrate accomplishments, right?" Elena asked one night while reviewing payroll reports. "I am aware. Then why do you look uncomfortable every time somebody compliments you?" I glanced toward the article still hanging crooked beside the coffee machine. "Because compliments in my family usually came right before criticism." Elena looked at me for a second before quietly saying, "That is not normal, Madeline." Maybe it was not, but I had lived inside that version of normal so long I barely recognized alternatives. In November, I flew to Chicago to speak at a national preservation conference held inside a restored Art Deco hotel overlooking the river. The ballroom ceiling stretched nearly 30 feet high with gold detailing across the plasterwork. Hundreds of architects, engineers, and developers filled the room while my name glowed across 2 giant screens near the stage. Madeline Carter, Principal and Founder, Carter Restoration Group. I stood backstage adjusting the sleeve of my black blazer while trying to steady my breathing. A volunteer clipped a microphone onto my lapel and smiled. "You nervous?" "A little," she laughed softly. "You do not look nervous." I thought about that afterward. Because maybe confidence is not loudness. Maybe sometimes it is simply surviving enough humiliation that public speaking no longer feels like the scariest thing in the room. The presentation lasted 40 minutes. I talked about structural preservation, adaptive reuse, hidden deterioration beneath cosmetic renovation. But mostly I talked about buildings people underestimate, places dismissed as too damaged or too expensive or too complicated until someone chooses to see value where others stopped looking. When the audience stood up afterward, applause filling the ballroom, something strange happened inside me. Not pride exactly. Recognition. Like part of me finally understood I had spent years waiting for approval from people incapable of giving it. Later that evening, during the networking reception, a man in his 60s approached me holding a bourbon glass. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you." I froze slightly. "Excuse me?" "Arthur Whitmore." He smiled gently. "I knew him years ago through preservation circles in Newport. You have his eyes." Hearing my grandfather's name spoken with warmth instead of tension almost caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said quietly. The man nodded toward my conference badge. "He used to say your family would eventually understand what you were building." My chest tightened unexpectedly. "Did he?" "Oh, yes." The man smiled again. "Arthur believed legacy mattered more than image. Rare quality in wealthy families. Legacy mattered more than image." I wrote that sentence in my hotel notebook later that night before falling asleep beside the city lights. By the time I returned to Providence, the Regional Preservation Excellence Award ceremony was less than 2 weeks away. Newport Harbor Preservation Hall. Black tie. More than 300 guests expected. Elena insisted I buy a proper gown after seeing the invitation. You cannot show up in one of your funeral blazers again. It is navy. Exactly my point. The morning of the ceremony, our office assistant dropped a thick envelope onto my desk. No return address. Inside was a copy of the event seating chart. My name sat near the front beside major developers, preservation directors, and city officials. Several rows behind them, under family guests, were Richard Whitmore, Evelyn Whitmore, and Sophie Whitmore. I stared at the paper while something cold moved slowly through my chest. They were coming. Not because they supported me. Because by then my name had become difficult to ignore publicly. At 6:45 that evening, I stood outside Preservation Hall watching black cars pull beneath strings of white lights, reflecting across Newport Harbor. Wind carried the smell of salt water through the cold November air. Elena adjusted the collar of my coat and smiled. Ready? Before I could answer, another car door opened farther down the curb. My parents stepped out first, Sophie behind them in silver silk. My mother looked up and saw me standing there beneath the entrance lights, with my name printed across the giant welcome banner above the doors. And for the first time in my entire life, I watched uncertainty cross her face instead of disappointment. That was 8 months before the anniversary party. 8 months before my mother stood at the ballroom entrance and told everyone I was not invited. The anniversary ballroom smelled like white roses, polished silver, and expensive perfume. A string quartet played near the windows overlooking the water, while servers moved carefully through the crowd carrying champagne trays balanced at shoulder height. Everything looked perfect from a distance. That was always my mother's specialty, perfection from a distance. Up close, you started noticing cracks. I stood near the entrance, holding the cream-colored gift box against my ribs, while conversations shifted quietly around me. People kept pretending not to stare. "Madeline?" a familiar voice said behind me. I turned and saw Catherine Holloway approaching in a black velvet dress with her husband beside her. Catherine had known my parents for years through preservation boards and charity committees. "I had no idea you were Richard and Evelyn's daughter," she said warmly. Before I could answer, my mother appeared beside us almost instantly. "Catherine," she interrupted smoothly. "You remember Sophie?" She guided my sister forward with one hand against her back like redirecting attention physically mattered. Sophie smiled perfectly. "It is so nice to see you again." Catherine glanced between us. Something in her expression shifted slightly. Confusion, maybe, or realization. "Of course," she said carefully. "Although I have been hearing Madeline's name everywhere lately." My mother's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Yes, well, she has been keeping very busy. Busy. Not successful, not accomplished, just busy." I looked down at the gift box ribbon beneath my fingers because suddenly I felt 17 again, standing too far back in family photographs. Across the ballroom, my father spoke with investors near the stage, but I noticed something strange immediately. He kept checking the same thing over and over. The dark green lockbox, positioned beside the slideshow projector. Even from 30 feet away, I could tell he was distracted by it. Nervous, maybe. My stomach tightened. "Where did that lockbox come from?" I asked quietly. Sophie's head turned too quickly. "What lockbox?" "The one beside the stage." My mother adjusted her bracelet without looking at me. "Old paperwork. Nothing important. Nothing important." Yet my father had looked at it 7 times in the last 10 minutes. A waiter offered champagne. I took a glass mostly to have something to hold. Nearby guests discussed real estate markets and summer homes in Martha's Vineyard, while the quartet shifted into softer music near the dance floor. My family moved through the room effortlessly greeting donors and investors, while I stood slightly outside the center of everything like always. Except this time something felt different beneath the surface. Tighter. Controlled too carefully. Sophie approached me about 20 minutes later, while everyone settled toward the dinner tables. "You should leave after dessert," she said quietly, without looking directly at me. I laughed once under my breath. "Still worried I will embarrass the family?" "This is not about embarrassment." "Then what is it about?" Sophie finally met my eyes. Her makeup looked flawless under the ballroom lights, but tension sat visibly along her jawline. "You do not understand what is happening." "Then explain it." She glanced toward our father across the room. "Some things were supposed to stay buried." Buried. The word settled heavily between us. "What things?" Sophie lowered her voice further. "Grandpa changed things before he died. I know that. No, she whispered sharply. You do not. Before I could answer, my mother called Sophie toward the stage for photographs. Sophie stepped away immediately like the conversation never happened. I watched her walk across the ballroom in silver silk, while guests smiled and cameras flashed. Then I looked back toward the lockbox again, my grandfather's lockbox. The same one my father claimed had been empty years ago, empty enough to disappear completely, empty enough for lawyers to suddenly panic when my name came up. My pulse started beating harder beneath my throat. Slowly, carefully, I moved through the ballroom toward the stage while servers cleared dinner plates around me. Nobody stopped me. Why would they? To most people, I was still just the difficult daughter carrying a gift nobody wanted. As I got closer, I noticed the lockbox had scratches across one corner I recognized instantly. I made those scratches myself at 13, trying to pry it open with a screwdriver because my grandfather used to keep peppermints inside. He laughed for 10 straight minutes when he caught me. You are terrible at committing crimes, Maddie, he told me afterward while handing me the key anyway. Key. My breath caught slightly. The brass key my grandfather gave me before he died still sat inside my apartment desk drawer, wrapped in an old receipt from a coffee shop in Providence. I had not thought about it in months. Suddenly, footsteps approached behind me. Do not touch that. My father's voice. Calm again. Too calm. I turned slowly. Up close, he looked older than he had 8 months earlier at the preservation ceremony. Thinner, too, the lines around his eyes deeper beneath the ballroom lighting. Why? I asked quietly. Because it is private. Private from who? He stared at me for a long moment while conversations and laughter drifted softly around us. Madeline, he said carefully, tonight is not the time for this. For what? For reopening old misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. The same word families use when the truth becomes inconvenient. I tightened my grip around the gift box. You erased me from this family. My father exhaled slowly through his nose. You always think emotionally instead of strategically. And you always think strategically instead of honestly. Something flickered across his face then. Not anger, fear. Real fear. Before either of us could say another word, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced warmly, before the anniversary tribute begins, the Whitmore family would like to open a few special gifts from close loved ones. My mother froze across the ballroom. Sophie went pale almost instantly. And my father looked directly at the cream-colored box in my hands, like he finally understood exactly why I came. The ballroom quieted as the master of ceremonies smiled toward the crowd and gestured at the gift table near the stage. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft gold light across hundreds of champagne glasses, while guests settled back into their seats expecting harmless anniversary speeches and sentimental stories. Nobody understood they were about to watch an entire family narrative collapse in real time. My mother recovered first. Of course she did. She stepped toward the microphone with a graceful smile that never quite reached her eyes. That is very kind, she said smoothly. But there is really no need to open gifts publicly. Nonsense, one of the investors called from the front table. That is the best part. Light laughter moved through the room. My father still stood beside me near the stage, close enough that I noticed the tension in his jaw. Madeline, he said quietly without looking directly at me, do not do this here. Do what? I asked calmly. Tell the truth? His silence answered for him. Across the ballroom, Sophie looked pale beneath the candlelight. She kept twisting the stem of her wineglass between both hands, hard enough that I thought it might snap. The master of ceremonies motioned toward me politely. Would you like to bring your gift forward? Every eye in the room shifted toward me then. The difficult daughter, the uninvited daughter, the daughter nobody quite knew where to place anymore. I walked toward the stage, slowly holding the cream-colored box against my chest, while heels clicked softly across the marble floor. No music played now. Even the quartet had stopped. I placed the box carefully beside the microphone. My mother stepped closer immediately. This really is unnecessary. Actually, I said softly, I think it is overdue. Her expression tightened. Madeline, I ignored her and looked toward my father instead. Do you want to tell them? He closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second, then opened them again. No. So I nodded once and untied the ribbon around the box. The room stayed completely silent, except for the faint sound of silverware settling onto plates somewhere near the back tables. Inside the box, sat 4 items: a brass key, a folded set of legal documents, a faded photograph, and a small cassette tape labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. My mother went completely still the second she saw the tape. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. I looked at her calmly. "Grandpa gave me the key before he died." Across the ballroom, someone shifted in their chair. My father stared at the cassette tape like he had seen a ghost. I picked up the photograph first and held it toward the audience. It showed my grandfather standing beside me at 16 inside the estate greenhouse, both of us covered in dirt after repairing storm damage to the foundation wall. On the back, written in blue ink, were the words, "The only one who stayed long enough to learn how to protect it." Several guests exchanged confused looks. My mother reached for the documents immediately. "This is private family business." "It became public family business when you erased me publicly." My voice stayed level. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. I handed the legal papers to the master of ceremonies instead. "Read the highlighted section." The man adjusted his glasses awkwardly beneath the stage lights while the ballroom watched in silence. "In the event of financial instability, foreclosure risk, or liquidation of Whitmore estate assets," he read slowly, "Protective Stewardship Authority shall transfer to Madeline Carter Whitmore under Preservation Trust guidelines established by Arthur Whitmore." Murmurs spread instantly through the room. My mother's face lost color. Sophie looked down at the floor. The master of ceremonies frowned slightly at the documents. "This is signed 15 years ago." "Yes," I replied quietly. "My grandfather created legal protections tied specifically to me because he believed the estate would eventually be treated like an asset instead of a home." My father finally spoke then. "Madeline." His voice sounded tired, not angry anymore, just tired. "Please." "Please what?" I asked gently. "Pretend none of this happened?" He looked at the crowd surrounding us. Investors, friends, donors, people who spent years hearing a version of me carefully edited by my family until I barely existed at all. "You told everyone Sophie protected this estate," I said. "But when the banks came after it, Sophie did not even know where the debt records were stored." Sophie's eyes filled instantly. "I never asked for this," she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. "No, you just accepted it." That landed harder because it was true. No screaming, no accusations, just truth finally spoken out loud where everyone could hear it. My mother stepped toward me again, lowering her voice sharply. "You are humiliating this family." I met her eyes steadily. "No, Mom, I think this family has been humiliating me for years." Complete silence followed that sentence. Then slowly, carefully, I picked up the cassette tape from the box. "There is one more thing." My father moved suddenly then, not aggressively, desperately. "Madeline, do not play that tape." For the first time all night, real fear crossed his face openly. Not fear of embarrassment, fear of exposure. I looked at him standing there beneath the anniversary lights, while every guest watched us. Then I turned toward the old cassette player positioned beside the slideshow projector, and my father whispered something that made the entire room go cold. "Your grandfather never wanted you to hear what is on that recording." I looked at my father for a long moment after he said those words. "Your grandfather never wanted you to hear what is on that recording." The ballroom had gone so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above the chandeliers. Nobody moved. Even the servers stood frozen near the back walls, holding silver trays against their chests. My father took one slow step toward me. "Madeline," he said carefully, "please." That word again. "Please." Strange how people discover softness only after control stops working. I glanced down at the cassette tape resting in my hand. The label had faded over time, but my grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. "Property notes for Maddie." My throat tightened unexpectedly at that, not because I was afraid anymore, because hearing his voice suddenly felt very close. "You lied to me for years," I said quietly. "I protected you," my father replied immediately. I let out a small breath through my nose. "Those are not the same thing." My mother stepped closer to the stage, her posture still perfect despite the panic flickering beneath it. "This has gone far enough." "Actually," I said calmly, "I think this started a very long time ago." Sophie still stood near the front tables, gripping her wine glass with both hands. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath her eyes. She looked smaller somehow, less polished. "Madeline," she whispered, "you do not understand what Grandpa was trying to do." I looked at her steadily. Then explain it. But she could not. Because the problem with family lies is that eventually everyone forgets where the performance ends and the truth begins. My father reached for the cassette player beside the slideshow projector before I could move. This conversation should happen privately. You already made it public, I replied softly, the moment you turned me into the family embarrassment instead of the person who saved your home. His hand stopped. Around us, guests avoided eye contact the way people do when they realize they are witnessing something painfully real. I think some of them finally understood this was never about inheritance, it was about erasure. I slid the cassette carefully into the player. My mother inhaled sharply. My father closed his eyes briefly. Then I pressed play. At first there was only static, a low, crackling sound filling the ballroom beneath the chandeliers. Then my grandfather's voice came through the speakers, older, slower, but steady. If you are hearing this, Maddie, it means your father finally made the mistake I was afraid of. Nobody in the room moved. Families like ours become dangerous when image matters more than honesty, my grandfather continued. Richard always cared too much about appearances. He mistakes polish for strength. My father looked down at the floor. But you, my grandfather said softly, you notice foundations. You stay when things get difficult. That is why the estate protections belong to you. My chest tightened so hard I had to steady myself against the stage table. I am leaving stewardship authority in your name because I trust your judgment more than anyone else in this family. Static crackled again. Then came the sentence that changed the room completely. And because if financial records tied to the Boston developments are ever investigated properly, your father may lose more than this house. My mother went completely pale. Several guests exchanged startled looks instantly. My father stepped toward the cassette player and shut it off. Silence crashed into the ballroom so hard it almost felt physical. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then, quietly, almost carefully, I asked, "What did he mean by that?" My father rubbed one hand across his mouth. Suddenly, he looked exhausted. Not powerful, not intimidating, just tired. "There were decisions made during the restructuring," he said finally. "Temporary decisions. Using the estate as collateral without disclosing the full liabilities?" I asked. His eyes snapped toward me immediately, which was answer enough. Sophie looked between us in confusion. "Dad?" He ignored her. My mother's voice trembled slightly for the first time all night. "Richard." He sat down slowly in one of the front chairs near the stage, as if his knees no longer trusted him. "I was trying to save everything your grandfather built. By rewriting legal protections in Sophie's name?" I asked quietly. "By cutting me out? Because you would have stopped me." He said it so honestly, the room seemed to shift around us. Not defensive, not angry, just true. I stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Yes," I said softly. "I would have." My mother looked suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of the room around her. Investors, friends, colleagues, everyone hearing pieces of a family story she spent years polishing into something prettier. "Madeline," she whispered, "we never wanted this." I looked at her calmly. "You may not have wanted this moment, but you absolutely wanted the version of me that came before it." Tears filled Sophie's eyes. "I did not know about the financial records." "I know," I told her gently. And I did know. That was the tragedy of it. Sophie had benefited from the lie without fully understanding the damage underneath it. My father finally looked up at me again. "What happens now?" The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my answer. I thought about every ignored phone call, every erased photograph, every dinner where I sat invisible while someone else wore my life like borrowed jewelry. Then I looked at my family standing beneath the anniversary flowers and candlelight. "Now?" I said quietly. "Now nothing gets hidden anymore. No yelling, no revenge, just a boundary finally spoken out loud." My mother lowered herself slowly into a chair beside my father like she suddenly needed support too. Across the room, guests started looking away politely, giving us privacy too late to matter. I picked up the photograph of my grandfather and slipped it carefully back into the gift box. My hands had stopped shaking completely. That surprised me most of all, because for the first time in years, I no longer felt like the unwanted daughter standing outside the family. I felt like someone finally standing inside the truth. And somehow that hurt almost as much. The anniversary party ended quietly after that. No dramatic shouting, no shattered glasses. just the slow, uncomfortable sound of reality settling into a room that had spent years protecting appearances over truth. Guests began leaving in careful silence, collecting coats and purses while avoiding direct eye contact with my family. The quartet never started playing again. I stood near the stage, packing the cassette tape, legal papers, and photograph back into the cream-colored box, while servers quietly cleared untouched dessert plates from the tables. My father remained seated near the front row long after most people left. He looked smaller somehow beneath the ballroom lights, older too. My mother stood beside the windows overlooking the harbor with both arms folded tightly across herself, like she suddenly felt cold. Sophie cried quietly near the hallway leading toward the restrooms, mascara streaked beneath her eyes, while several relatives awkwardly pretended not to notice. Nobody knew what to say anymore because the family story they understood had collapsed in front of them. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired, deeply tired. There is no celebration in finally proving you deserve to be loved all along. Around midnight, I carried the gift box toward the ballroom exit while workers began folding white linens from the tables. Halfway to the doors, I heard my father behind me. Madeline. I stopped but did not turn immediately. His footsteps approached slowly across the marble floor. "I should have told the truth years ago," he said quietly. I looked at him then, really looked at him. Not the intimidating businessman everyone respected, just a man standing inside the consequences of his own fear. "Why did you not?" I asked softly. He stared down at his hands for a long moment before answering. "Because every decision after the financial collapse became about survival. Then survival became image, then image became habit." I nodded slightly because, strangely enough, I understood that. Not agreed with it, understood it. Families do not usually break apart in one catastrophic moment. They erode slowly through silence, avoidance, ego, and the desperate need to protect appearances. "You hurt me," I said finally. My father's face tightened instantly. "I know, and the worst part is you let me believe I deserved it." He closed his eyes briefly at that. For the first time in years, he did not defend himself. My mother approached us slowly then, heels quiet against the marble floor. Her makeup still looked perfect somehow, but her eyes looked exhausted. "Madeline," she whispered, "I do not know how to fix this." I held the gift box tighter against my chest. "You cannot fix years in one night." Tears filled her eyes immediately. I think that was the moment she finally understood the damage was not about inheritance or legal documents or public embarrassment. It was about what happens to a daughter when the people who are supposed to protect her spend years teaching her she is hardest to love when she is fully herself. Sophie walked over next. She looked fragile in a way I had never seen before, not glamorous, not polished, just human. "I am sorry," she whispered, "for all of it." I believed she meant it. That surprised me too. I reached forward and gently straightened the twisted bracelet on her wrist, the same way I used to when we were little girls getting ready for church. "You do not have to carry roles people handed you forever," I told her quietly. She started crying harder after that. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, I finally stepped outside Preservation Hall. Cold ocean air hit my face instantly. The harbor lights shimmered across dark water, while wind carried the distant sound of boat cables knocking softly against masts. For the first time in years, my chest felt quiet, not healed completely, but honest. There is a difference. A few weeks later, my father voluntarily stepped back from several business positions tied to the estate restructuring. Independent auditors reviewed the financial records connected to the old development deals. Nothing criminal emerged, but enough ethical concerns surfaced that several investors quietly distanced themselves. Sophie left Whitmore Holdings entirely and enrolled in graduate school for nonprofit management. She told me one afternoon over coffee, "I think I spent most of my life becoming whoever made Mom comfortable." I understood that feeling more than she realized. My relationship with my parents did not magically transform after the anniversary party. Healing is slower than revelation. Some conversations remained awkward. Some wounds stayed tender. But boundaries change things. I stopped accepting guilt disguised as obligation. I stopped shrinking myself to preserve someone else's comfort. And strangely, once I stopped begging to be chosen, people finally started seeing me clearly. 6 months later, I visited the estate alone for the first time in years. Early morning fog rolled across the lawn, while ocean wind moved gently through the hedges. Inside the greenhouse, I found one of my grandfather's old gardening gloves hanging exactly where he used to leave it. Worn leather, dirt still pressed into the fingertips. I stood there holding it for a long time while sunlight slowly filtered through the glass ceiling above me. When I was younger, I thought healing meant getting everyone to finally understand your pain. Now I think healing is quieter than that. Sometimes it is simply learning that your worth existed long before anyone recognized it. If you are listening to this while carrying heartbreak inside your own family, I hope you remember something important. Love that asks you to disappear is not love. Real love leaves room for truth. Protect your name. Protect your peace. Protect your financial independence and your emotional boundaries, because both matter more than people tell you. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. God or the universe or whatever you believe in often speaks through the quiet discomfort we try hardest to ignore. And if people misunderstand you while you are becoming yourself, let them. Not everyone is meant to understand your healing while it is happening. My name is Madeline Carter. I am 34 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let someone else's fear convince you that your voice is too much to deserve a place in your own story. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Truly, I know stories like this can feel painfully familiar for some people, but maybe hearing someone else survive it reminds you that you are not weak for hurting, and you are not difficult for finally choosing yourself. If this story meant something to you, I would love to hear where you are watching from and what part touched your heart most deeply. And if you want more stories about family, healing, betrayal, resilience, and quiet strength, there are more waiting for you in the playlist right here on this channel. Some will break your heart a little, some might help put it back together, and one of them may end up sounding a lot more like your own story than you expected.